Ours is essentially a tragic age. The cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. We start to build up new little habitats, to have new little hopes. It is rather hard work. There is no smooth road into the future. But we go round or scramble over the obstacles. We've got to live, no matter how many skies have fallen. A cataclysm had certainly happened. The event in question, the Great War, a brutal conflict waged between 1914 to 1918 that claimed over 40 million lives in its wake. It was primarily fought by the allies of the Triple Entente, comprising the Third French Republic, the British Empire and Tsarist Russia, against the Central Powers of Imperial Germany, the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary. The makeup of these factions altered somewhat throughout the course of the conflict, with the entrance of Italy in 1915 and the US in 1917 on the side of the Allies, and the surrender of Tsarist Russia to Germany in 1918, but broadly hostilities remained the same. After several long and bloody years of trench warfare, the stalemate finally broke when the Allied forces penetrated the last German bulwark, the Hindenburg Line, in late September 1918. With this catastrophic loss, the Germans requested an armistice on the 4th of October, and the war finally drew to a bitter close on the 11th of November, with the agreement of a ceasefire famously signed at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So what came next? Well, as Aristotle stated, we make war that we may live in peace, but we lose the fruits of victory if peace is not properly organised thereafter. Thus it was imperative for a suitable peace arrangement to be agreed upon and formalised by written treaties. Now, as much as the other Central Powers were enemies of the Entente, Germany was very much viewed as the prima inimicus. Accordingly, it was expected that the Allies would be tougher on Germany than they would to the others. Weeks passed, and soon plenipotentiaries from the victorious nations all convened in Paris at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to formulate the various treaties. Each would outline the fate of different Central Powers. One, of course, would be devised specifically to deal with Germany, and it was seen as important that it do so with appropriate exception. After a considerable duration of heated debates and numerous logistic concerns, an agreement was finally struck, and the treaty was signed in Versailles on the 28th of June 1919. Incidentally, the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the first domino that precipitated the historic conflict. To say that the Treaty of Versailles garnered a somewhat murky reputation would certainly be an understatement. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who was the financial secretary to the Treasury of the Paris Peace Conference, termed it a Carthaginian peace, likening it to the crushing devastation visited upon ancient Carthage by the Roman Empire after the Second and Third Punic Wars. That's a fairly unflattering comparison from Keynes, so what exactly did the treaty stipulate? Well, first it demanded a significant territorial amputation. Articles 27 to 30 detailed how Germany would lose a whopping 70,000 square kilometres of land, roughly 13% of their total landmass, and an area that contained an estimated 10.2% of their overall population. Furthermore, Articles 119 to 127 saw the dismantlement of Germany's empire, with most of its provinces being ceded to the League of Nations to measure as mandates controlled by Allied states. Second, it ordered a sizable reduction of Germany's military forces, or the Reichswehr. Articles 159 to 221 defined that the Reichswehr would be restricted to a maximum of 100,000 soldiers. Moreover, its navy was limited to only 36 ships and 15,000 personnel, with additional bars put on submarines and military aircraft. Fortifications, artillery, and existing stocks of weapons in the Rhineland also had to be destroyed. Third, and some would argue most critically, Article 231 pressed that Germany take full responsibility for the outbreak of the Great War. This is sometimes referred to as the War Guilt Clause or Kriegsschuld. And finally, Article 233 dictated that Germany would have to pay reparations for the damages caused during the war. The Inter-Allied Reparation Commission would determine the exact extent of this amount on May 1, 1921, but in the meantime Article 235 asked for an initial payment of 20 billion gold marks, the logistics of which would be explained in Articles 236 to 244. When May 1st dawned, the amount Germany was expected to pay was revealed to be a colossal 132 billion gold marks. All in all, it would appear a ruthless and inexplicably draconian treaty, with vast losses of land, a near complete disintegration of its military forces, a humiliating moral burden to bear, and calamitous debts that it would never be able to repay. It is to no surprise that the Germans weren't too happy about this. They viewed it as a dictated peace, and accordingly the treaty came to be known as the Versailles Diktat. Many historians often cite it as a key factor contributing to the later collapse of the Weimar Republic and subsequent rise of Hitler's Third Reich. So what on earth inspired the Allies to be so severe and revanchist, and why was the treaty so uniquely harsh? The short answer? It kinda wasn't. To elaborate, it is first important to establish what treaties commonly looked like around this period. We'll soon notice that they principally involved monetary indemnity and the annexation of land. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, it was agreed that France would have to pay an indemnity of 700 million francs and would lose the territories of the Saar and Savoy. After the First Germanic Unification War, the Kingdom of Denmark lost 1/3 of its total territory. After the Second, Prussia also seized the Kingdom of Hanover from Austria, as well as the Guelphs, with Hesse and Frankfurt also being annexed. They were additionally charged an indemnity of 30 million guilders. Even outside of Europe, in the Orient, the same nature of treaties could be found. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, marking the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, saw China cede vast territories to Japan and pay the equivalent of 8 million kilograms of silver in indemnity, although the true cost of reparations was closer to 13,000 tons. There are two particular treaties, however, that is important to look at. First, the Treaty of Versailles, a separate treaty of the same name signed in 1871 at the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War. This saw Germany seize the territory of Alsace-Lorraine from the newly formed French Third Republic. It also stipulated that France would pay Germany 5 billion francs. The second is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed between Germany and Russia after Russia's premature exit from the Great War. It visited some pretty heavy costs upon the new Bolshevik government. Russia lost 34% of its population, 54% of its industrial land, 89% of its coal fields, 26% of its railways, and was fined an indemnity of 300 million gold marks. By considering these cases, we can see that it was not unusual for treaties to be characterized by severe territory loss and financial indemnity. Moreover, we can see that Germany herself was quite fond of these treaties, as can be evidenced by their own strict treatment of France and Russia. So with this in mind, let us examine the land losses to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles 1919. In the part of the treaty titled Political Clauses for Europe, it was established that the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg would be excluded from the German customs union, and that a plebiscite was to be held in Schleswig. Furthermore, Belgium would annex Moresnet and the 400 square miles between Eupen and Malmedy to make up for the lack of timber caused by German scorched earth. Germany objected to the latter on the basis of the population being German. In reality, they spoke Walloon. Alsace-Lorraine, the same territory confiscated by Germany at the 1871 Treaty of Versailles, would be restored to France, as was covered in one of Wilson's 14 points. Quote, "The wrong done to France by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine should be righted in order that peace may once more be made secure in the interest of all." As noticed, the total of this doesn't approach the severeness of prior treaties that Germany herself had issued. What's more, Germany's estimated 13% territory loss and resultant 10.2% population loss, as initially seemed the case, was later corrected by the historian Robert Boyce. He approximated that even with the land taken to form the Polish corridor, the losses are closer to a 9.5% in territory and 7% in population, a figure far more reasonable and comparatively hardly outrageous. There is good evidence to suggest that such territory losses weren't too economically damaging to Germany either. For example, despite Keynes's prediction that the iron and steel industries would diminish as a result of the treaty, in 1927 Germany produced 30% more iron and 38% more steel than their record year in 1913. Interestingly, the French president Raymond Poincaré favoured much harsher land amputations, with the German border pushed all the way back to the Rhine, with the French annexing the associated territories. This would make sense, as the inhabitants of these regions were Rhenish after all, but it was vetoed for being too harsh. A goodwill gesture, as, had Germany won the war, it would have incorporated large parts of Eastern Europe, the European Russia, much of northern France, and the whole of Belgium and Luxembourg. Compared to this, writes historian Jürgen Tamke, and taking into account the terms imposed by Prussia on defeated states in the second half of the 19th century, German losses at Versailles were moderate. Next, let's look at the German disarmament demanded by the treaty. As explained before, the military or Reichswehr were restricted to 100,000 men, and their naval forces greatly diminished. This ordinance was particularly insulting for Germany, who had, through Prussian leadership, been principally an industrial military nation. It was sometimes even jokingly referred to as an army with a state. The military restrictions seemed deliberately humiliating as a result. However, the dismantlement of the German navy looks fairly reasonable. For one, although, quote, there was no international rule forbidding aspiring powers from building large and expensive battle fleets, they had to have a reason. Britain had an empire, Germany did not. And therefore there was no need, outside of aggression, for their navy to exceed a certain size. Moreover, even with Germany surrendering all ships over 1,600 tons to compensate the British for the damages of German submarine warfare, by 1921 the German merchant fleet was greater than its pre-war size. It would appear that the restrictions to Germany's navy weren't all that damaging. More crucially, however, there was good evidence that the disarmament clauses were, in a sense, never expected to be seriously observed. Versailles expert Stephen Schucker commented that military men no more believed in the permanent disarmament of a major industrial nation than they gave credence to the tooth fairy. Supporting this fact, Brigadier General J.H. Morgan published articles in the Times in 1921, warning that the Reichswehr, in spite of the 100,000 men restriction, had enough personnel, clothing and armaments to account for 800,000. The 62 disarmament protocols supervised by the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission, writes Macmillan, were like the ropes of the Lilliputians over Gulliver. All in all, it would seem the military restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles weren't too stringent. The war guilt or Kriegsschuld clause in particular caused significant upset with the German people, especially as it seemed like the Allies scapegoating Germany for their own aggressive imperialist policies. However, it is important to note that the war guilt was the ascription of theoretical guilt in order to provide legal grounds for the reparations. Without Germany and her allies taking technical accountability for the war, the reparations could not be justified. Thus, Germany had to accept war guilt. It is worth noting that none of Germany's allies found such a demand objectionable, and instead viewed it as a mere consequence of defeat. Perhaps though, despite the legal necessity, it still seems like an unfair burden to rest on Germany alone, and that the Allies were unfairly demonising of them. US President Woodrow Wilson, for instance, even went so far as to describe German high command as without conscience or honour or capacity for covenanted peace. But even if this was the case, and even if allocating quote-unquote total responsibility is altogether excessive, it's apparent that Germany was at least very responsible for the outbreak of war. It was the German offensive outlined in the Schlieffen Plan that saw them invade a neutral Belgium in order to seize France. The September programme also clarifies Germany's ambition for territorial expansion, with the Rhenish industrialist August Thyssen and the Pan-German League planning for Germany to incorporate Belgium, the French Nord, the Pas-de-Calais, Poland, the Crimea, Odessa, and the Baltic provinces. The German Chancellor himself, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, even stated that the war was not to restore the European balance of power, but precisely to eliminate for all time that which had been termed the balance of power, and to lay the foundation for German predominance in Europe. This attitude is what prompted the Italian Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, who had been their ally, to rule that Germany and Austria's behaviour had an aggressive character that was not in line with the defensive purposes of the Triple Alliance. Lastly, a retrospective internal report on the question of war guilt 1914, sanctioned by Eugene Fischer-Behling, General Secretary of the Reichstag Commission investigating the causes of war, was censored and stopped from publication by its own Foreign Office. Gustav Stresemann, the foreign minister, warned that the report, if published, will definitely damage our reputation abroad by laying the chief blame for the outbreak of the World War upon Austria and Germany. All in all, it would be no stretch of the imagination to claim that Germany and her allies were greatly responsible for the outbreak of war anyway. The logistical matter of ascribing responsibility for damages doesn't seem too unreasonable a jump. Finally is the matter of the 132 billion gold marks demanded by the treaty in reparations, a figure designed to account for the total cost of the war. The debt was divided into A, B and C bonds. A and B bonds, which amounted to a nominal value of 50 billion gold marks, covered genuine war debts such as occupation costs, coal deliveries, reparations and food purchases. They were to carry a modest interest of 5% and were to be delivered to the Reparation Commission by the 21st of July and 1st of November 1921 respectively. In short, Germany had to pay 2 million gold marks per annum in addition to a variable annuity of 26% of the value of Germany's exports. C bonds, on the other hand, were only to be authorised once the obligations under the A and B bonds had been met. But hang on, to do this Germany would need to export to the value of approximately 21 billion gold marks per annum, which would, writes Marx, depend upon complete German good faith, favourable political conditions and extraordinary German prosperity, and even then would remain improbable. This situation is best surmised by Gaston Firth, Assistant Secretary of the Belgian delegation to the Reparation Commission. Quote, "The authors of the schedule of payments knew themselves that the sea bonds were only a fiction, and that if they had not wished or dared to touch the total of the debt, they had deliberately arranged to reduce in fact to 50 billion the nominal amount of 132 billion. So 82 billion marks was never intended to be real debt, as realistically its conditions would never allow it to eventuate. The real debt Germany had to pay was set at 50 billion marks, a considerable figure sure, but incidentally one which Germany had earlier offered to the US government. The 132 billion figure was an undoubtedly useful and necessary deception, designed to satiate the European powers that demanded severity without destabilising Germany too much financially. If the Allies had publicly charged the true figure of just 50 billion, their electorate back home would have been outraged. Not a good move for the politicians, for, writes Alexander Solzhenitsyn, peace treaties are meant to strengthen one's prestige with the electorate. We can now see that the reparation figure, despite looking initially insane, was actually a very carefully considered political move, and in actuality, not as outrageous as it seems. Accordingly, you now hopefully have a good overall understanding for the reasons of the Treaty of Versailles, and see that most of its demands were in reality fairly reasonable given the context, and hardly of exception. Moreover, they were arguably intended towards eventual peace, which after all, writes Albert Camus, is the only goal worth struggling for. And I'm afraid that is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it or found it interesting, please show your support by liking it. Additionally, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and is a great way of helping more people see our content. Another great way is by sharing one of our videos or telling your friends about us. Who knows, they may find it interesting too. I've linked some of our content here, but there's plenty more on the channel page. By all means, please explore, and remember to hit that notification bell so you know when we release a new video. As always everyone, thank you for watching.